Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome to Sunday Bulwark Live. Also on afterwards, if you don't catch it live on YouTube, obviously on our website and on YouTube. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Adrian Carrasquillo, who joined us 6 months ago, I think. And
it's a new year.
It's been a great addition. Fantastic newsletter on immigration policy or deportation policy, really more. I'd say, That's one thing I've been slightly obsessed with. People keep talking about Trump's immigration policy, but his immigration policy is not to have any immigrants, basically. And what we're really talking about is a deportation policy, right? I mean, it's striking, Anyway, you've done a great job covering that. And I was personally so pleased when Adrian joined us because I believe I was the only native New Yorker at the Bulwark. And now we've doubled.
We have a second one. Yeah, I'm from Queens. Where are you from?
Manhattan.
Okay.
But you went to high school in Manhattan at Stuyvesant, right?
Yes, I did.
And you must have been there during 9/11. Not too far.
Was there during 9/11, 3 blocks away, a very formative time in my life and all of my friends.
Is that right? Really? Yeah. You don't forget that, right? I was in D.C. and our son was about 5 miles from the Pentagon, so that plane saw it hit or saw the after effects of it hitting.
You never minimize someone's experience. People will say, I was in school in Montana and I saw it on TV. And I'm like, I was a little closer and it was a little scary,
What did you do? I mean, you're in school, it's like 8:30, 8:40 in the morning, obviously.
We were in gym class and we heard a plane hit. And so us being, just teenagers said, oh, I know where I can get a view of the tower to see what's really going on. And we went to the physics lab and we could see both burning metal, but we could also see people coming falling. And so then that was, of course, bad. And so we were brought to homeroom. We were brought to a class and the second plane hit live on TV as we were watching TV right 3 blocks away. Then we were brought to homeroom. We were evacuated. So it was definitely just an insane day.
Yeah, for people who don't know New York, Stuyvesant is way down in Lower Manhattan, so it's very close to where the tower was, obviously.
Yeah.
And you went? What did you do? Could you get back home to Queens? Or?
No, we could not get back home to Queens. We could not talk to our parents. We just went. The nice part about being part of the football team, have a little community. So a dozen of us walked to a friend's place, and we played NBA Jam because we did not want to watch loop CNN footage of the towers falling. So it just reminds you that you were a kid, but at the time, you think you're a big kid, but really it was just you're a teenager and crazy historic things happening.
Yeah, I've always wondered if people in DC and New York had a sort of different experience, not to minimize or claim anything for it. Obviously just where you are is where you are. You can't, but I do feel like it was more personal, obviously. Right?
For sure.
Yeah. Okay. So that was a memorable, depressing, and terrible day, and now we're in another memorable and somewhat depressing and bad moment, I think.
Is there anything going on in the news, Bill?
I don't know. When we agreed to do this show a few days ago, I thought we'd discuss El Salvador and Venezuela, the Venezuelans, and the legal cases for the individuals who were unjustly deported. But I think we probably need to begin with LA. And one of the great advantages of having you is you have such good context and sources. You've been reporting on immigration for quite a while, and now on deportation. So the lawyers are explaining what is and isn't happening. I think doing a pretty good job. Some of our friends, but what's your sense? You've talked to people out there in LA. What's your sense of what's really happening? I mean, have been happening and now happening. It might happen on the ground.
Yeah, I think we could set the stage a little bit. Actually, there were these reports. NBC News had a story 4 days ago that Stephen Miller was just sort of apoplectic and saying that there needs to be 3,000 arrests a day. And that they need to be why aren't they going into Home Depots? And they're scaling up Operation at Large, which is thousands of agents from ICE and FBI to even IRS agents, to go into communities more for interior enforcement, right? And so it's not a coincidence that then they are going into a Home Depot in Los Angeles. They're going into the garment district. They're going into restaurants in LA. And, what I was thinking about, Bill, is I said, okay, Paramount, California is massive. So let me read about Paramount. It's 82% Latino. This is a state that we know is heavily Hispanic.
It's a town that's just outside LA.
Yeah. So in Paramount is where they arrested 20 workers. And altogether over the Friday, Saturday, so far, they've arrested 120 workers in California and largely in LA. And so, 82% Latino. And that just reminded me that, we've heard so much about when in this mass deportation crackdown, immigrants receding into the shadows. And I think that's true in a lot of cities. I think, small city in Tennessee, you're going to work, you're coming home, you're trying to stay off the radar, you're trying not to get in trouble so you don't have your family ripped apart. And you're very, very much so the minority. But in California and LA, you're not. Immigrants are the lifeblood of the economy. And you very much can sort of fight back on ICE, and you outnumber, of course, and people are saying, wait a second, you're not going for criminals, which we know they're not doing, and they're going now for workers and people who've been paying their taxes and have been here 15, 20 years. And so I think that is part of the almost overlooked part of what's going on, because we're so quick, and we will talk about them going into and bringing in the National Guard and how the Trump administration is so excited to sort of clamp down on violent protest or protests in general. But I think that's an important thing to think about. California, Los Angeles is a different animal when it comes to immigration enforcement.
Yeah, that's very interesting. People haven't really focused. They just assume it could be happening anywhere, but it actually probably couldn't be happening just anywhere. It's not an accident that's happening in a place like Southern California. And what is your sense of what's been happening for the last 24, 48 hours in terms of the level of violence, the level to which it's out of control, and there might be a legitimate case for getting some supplementary law enforcement, or I guess that's not quite law enforcement, supplementary force in to handle it and so forth.
Yeah, look, the LAPD is not famed to be beloved by liberals and Democrats and things like that. Let's just say, there's a long history there. The LAPD put out a statement and said that these were largely peaceful protests. Of course, there have been incidents. I think in Paramount was where the Home Depot was, where there was video of ICE vehicles driving by, SUVs, people throwing rocks and things like that. And so then the response came back of dispersing them with rubber bullets and, obviously less than lethal force and things like that. So from my sense, there's been isolated smaller incidents, but I think you and I both know that this is the Donald Trump, Stephen Miller are sort of like dying for a moment like this, right? Because we know that Trump is not one of these presidents who even like feigns to say, I represent everybody. He sees his political opponents as his enemies. So LA, California, there's 1 million undocumented people in California. And if you think about that, that's a pretty crazy number. Most sort of reputable, statisticians and people who cover this stuff will say there's about, 11 to 13 million undocumented people. Of course, Marco Rubio and Donald Trump have said 15, 20 million, 25 million. The numbers are just always insane when it comes to them. But for 1 million of them to be in California, I think that says a lot. And I think this is a fight that definitely the administration is spoiling and happy to have. I think then we can get into there could be problems for the administration as they ramp up this enforcement. I think we will see Americans standing up and fighting back a little bit more.
Yeah, that'll be. Well, let's talk about that in a minute. But just in terms of where we stand, so we're speaking noon Eastern time Sunday. It's still early, reasonably early Sunday morning in LA. I think I saw the mayor of LA saying there's not been National Guard deployed on the streets yet, or even the reason Trump doesn't have to invoke the Insurrection Act is he's using the Guard and conceivably our active duty military. That's in the presidential memorandum last night, which people should read. Goes very far, in my opinion, stopping just short of the Insurrection Act, but it's to protect federal facilities and functions, exactly. I think, which that gives him he doesn't, not actual law enforcement, protecting other law enforcement officers. Federal functions is a pretty broad term, though, so that gets you pretty close, I think, down that slippery slope. But anyway, your sense, Karen Bass, the mayor of LA, said so far the National Guard hasn't been deployed, and my sense is it was a peaceful night. I mean, right, we're not like 1992, which I remember vividly being in the first Bush White House, and going through the night with killings and fires and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that gives away a little bit of the game that this is not, Los Angeles, California is not burning, but you're right. I mean, the Trump administration federalizing the National Guard, sending 2,000 National Guard, Governor Gavin Newsom saying, we don't need this. This is an escalation. This is unnecessary. This is too early. I was just reading the LA Times, and they were saying that National Guard has been spotted around some federal buildings already, but I don't think that, what I think I would look for is that there's a City Hall, Los Angeles gathering, demonstration, protest, 2 p.m. Pacific time, so that'd be 5 p.m. Eastern. And I mean, I know you haven't watched Andor yet, and I'm not about to give spoilers to the audience who's here for politics, and now they're like, don't ruin this show that I want to watch. All I will say is there's a very famous sort of rebellion, and it gets into the empire with propaganda and sort of setting up state violence. And so, of course, this is serious. It's not a joke. So I don't think that that's necessarily going to happen. But when I see that there's a planned event today and that there's all this National Guard coming into the state, like that's the most recent media that sort of like flashes to me, which is a little scary. But I think the administration is happy to have this fight.
Yeah, it's striking with looking at that presidential memorandum. It's been reported a lot. Understandably, the headline 2,000 National Guard. The actual memorandum says at least 2,000 National Guard. It's kind of a funny way of phrasing it, directed to the Secretary of Defense. Usually, I think one puts an upper limit on how much force you can use before coming back to get more authorization. Here, it's a lower limit. I want you to deploy at least 2,000 National Guard and any active duty military that you think necessary to secure federal, I think it's facilities and functions. Very open delegation to the Secretary of Defense, and Hikes has already tweeted about possibly using active duty Marines from Camp Pendleton about 30, 40, 50 miles to the south along the coast. So I mean, I do believe that. Well, you covered the administration, so let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, do you not believe this was where it was always heading, in the sense that they as you say, they wanted to provoke, they were willing to provoke, let's not be too overboard, they were at least willing to provoke demonstrations, willing to use that as a reason to not go quite to the Insurrection Act, but go to using active duty military. And I do think we're now just a step or two from, if there's a little violence, or I hope there isn't, or seems like there's violence, or seems like there are more threats to ICE agents, to pretty having active duty military on the streets of a major American city,
Yes, and when he did his spate of executive actions in his first couple days, and the legal community and a lot of the folks and lawyers that we talked to were sort of horrified by everything they were seeing. The one thing they told me is, like, the only thing we're stopping short of is soldiers in American cities. He's literally doing everything else that he said he was going to do, that he promised he was going to do, that he warned he was going to do. So that's interesting, because when he declared the national emergency at the border, there was always this opportunity and this possibility that besides soldiers at the border, that now they could go into cities, right? And so that's been a fear in many ways, and I think this is also sort of a gateway into the rest of the immigration stuff we want to chat about. This is what the mass deportation policy, where it sort of was always going to go, because you start with, we're sort of intimidating and we're spreading fear, and there's a lot of immigrants in the shadows, the stuff I talked about, just driving to work, going back home. And there's people that are afraid, but human nature is also not just to be afraid, but to also be angry if you're going into their community. And if you're taking away workers. This began with somebody the other day, I think it was Jim Acosta, might have said to me, like, the big lie is the election, but the second big lie is, like, that we're only going for criminals. And of course, people didn't know what mass deportation was. There was, and I know you know this, but I'll just say it for people who are watching. There 100% was frustration with Joe Biden's border policy. That was a fact. And so people wanted that to be tightened up. And what the Trump administration did was sort of bring in the Trojan horse of, yeah, we're going to do that and more. And so what would we expect when you're going into these majorly predominantly immigrant and Latino communities, with way too much force, right? We've seen that with the masked agents who will not give their identity. What the hell would we do if somebody, like, wanted to, masked person wanted to throw us into a van? Like, whoa, hold on a second, what the hell's going on here? So I mean, and I think that, like, Stephen Miller, as we saw with his tweets yesterday, saying this is an invasion, saying this is an insurrection, they're just happy to be able to have these images on Fox News and to say that no, it's not us doing this. But yesterday, I think it was ICE, or the administration was releasing that some of the people they were arresting were these, of course, typical gang members and killers and rapists and all this stuff. And people are showing video of them grabbing workers at Home Depot and, like, roughly throwing them against a gate. So, it's just, we sort of have seen this for months, but now it's really just hitting this boiling point.
This will seem like a stupid question, I guess, but why are they committed to the mass deportation? I mean, I guess they believe in it as a policy, but it's so, as from a sort of more standard political point of view, you fix the border, you overdo it, maybe literally no one can basically get in now, but maybe there should be some people let in seeking asylum, but whatever. I mean, they fix that from their point of view, and probably, to be frank, from the point of view of the majority of the American public. For now, at least, it seems like a good, let's fix the border until we can figure out what's going on, to use Trump's phrase.
Yeah.
And there's never obvious how much support there was for mass deportation, especially as you say, once you get beyond the kind of, criminals and people who there isn't much sympathy for. But they are really resolute on this. I think people have, I don't know, I feel like my friends who are kind of still working in, some of them working in under the, like an old-fashioned political framework, don't quite understand and I guess I don't even fully understand, what's going on here with Trump and Miller and Homan and these guys. They think this is important, I guess, huh?
Look, I mean, I think I've wrote about Miller wanting to make America white again, and Terry Moran just got suspended, at ABC for what he said yesterday about Stephen Miller, where he said that this guy is sort of motivated and fueled by bile and by hatred, and so he's getting suspended for that. Stephen Miller used to be on the fringes of the Republican Party, on the far right with Sessions and with Krikorian. And now he's, leading domestic policy for the United States. So I think that, like, we always know that Trump politicizes everything, and like that's his North Star, and his sort of gold ring success. But Miller, I mean, when you look what you just described, you said most Americans agree criminals. So Pew, which does great polling on this stuff, said that Americans, basically 97% of Americans support getting criminals out. Okay, so we've got that down. But then the folks in the middle, the folks who are not the MAGA deport everyone and the sort of open borders crowd, only 5% support deporting the spouse of a U.S. citizen. I think it's 9% support deporting dreamers, and then you just go down the line. It's these really low numbers. So, I mean, I've heard Republicans say kind of like, how is this going to help us in 2026? Yeah, the early shut down the border, sort of fix the problems we were having under Biden. Like, yes, there's support for that. But we've seen in focus groups, both Bulwark focus groups, but also some exclusive focus groups I got access to, was some Latino voters in Arizona, and half of them saying they already regret their vote for Donald Trump. And what I think is important to understand is immigration is not the number one issue with these voters, but it's sort of this powerful number two, where you have the economy and jobs. And they said, I voted for Trump to help my family, the construction workers, furniture delivery guys. And they said, so that's not happening. Now he's doing tariffs. The economy is floundering. But on top of that, you're taking out tax-paying people who've been here 10, 15 years. And so they always would mention immigration as sort of this, like, buttressing issue that said, like, what the hell's going on? So open question, but I think with Miller, we know some of the stuff of what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you believe in some version of the Great Replacement theory, and there are different kinds of it, you might say different, more or less extreme, all pretty extreme versions of it, you do need to do deportation. I mean, just as a practical, if you think it's a huge problem that America is getting a lot browner and somewhat blacker and darker complexion in general, that it's a huge problem that X percent, different numbers in different periods, but 30% of kids in, I don't know, elementary school maybe are not Caucasian or the children of immigrants. And some of those are undocumented immigrants, obviously, and the X percentage 20 years from now are going to be the children of those children and so forth. You need the deportation. I mean, I guess I myself have not taken that quite seriously enough, I've got to say. I think I've been correct in seeing that immigration was itself an excuse for the authoritarian agenda. Because I think for Trump, someone like Trump, who was not involved in these issues until 2015, it's more immigration is the issue people really care about and the issue he can demagogue. And he wants to, run a lawless and administration where he can make unbelievable amounts of money, but also do whatever he wants and break the law and maybe stay in power for quite a long time and so forth. And so for him, the immigration is a little more maybe a means to the authoritarian end. But I suppose for Miller and Homan and some of these people, it is part of the end. That is, it is an actual goal that they take very seriously.
Well, that starts to get into also what they're doing with due process, where it's like, oh, well, these guys are bad dudes. So we say, take our word for it. You have to believe our insane rubric around tattoos that no scholar or anyone who's written books on this stuff says is true about gang members from Venezuela. So first, believe that these are all terrible people. the worst of the worst. And then it's like that slippery slope. And I know that there can be worlds where people say, oh, liberals saying this is going to happen. Donald Trump has said that US citizens, homegrowns, would be next. And so if they're taking away due process from people, the ability for someone to say, hey, actually, listen, I'm not a gang member, just so you know, then why can't that happen to other people? I think another interesting part is I was reading before that going after undocumented workers really slowed down and stopped during COVID because we realized they were delivering, packing, making our food. So it's like how quickly we forget certain lessons and essential workers and immigrants and all this stuff. I lived in Hoboken. Well, I lived in North Bergen during the pandemic in New Jersey. So I was across, and I lived in sort of this area in North Bergen around Jersey City. And when I went to the supermarket, it was sort of horrifying in the sense that so many of the people who were neighbors were essential workers. And there was just so many people with masks and it was, I remember one guy had like styrofoam sticks to his head, so you couldn't get closer than 6 feet to him. And then I walked to Hoboken, which is a much whiter city, which was a lot more remote friendly. And it seemed like the safest place in America. You know what I mean? So it's just like I can't help but think about the way that we have sort of been like, hey, anyway, pandemic, that's over. But yeah, you're right. In a time where we have such insane political gridlock, and it's easy for for Americans to say that immigrants are either taking my jobs or are the enemy. Trump has stoked that more than anyone else.
Where do you think this goes, just in terms of LA and the National Guard? I mean, it could peter out, or this could be a bit of a trial run that gets resurrected 2 months from now. It could explode. I mean,
a couple of the previews of my newsletter that I'm going to be working on today for tomorrow. My headphone. Is
people need to read, subscribe to your newsletter and read it. Huddled Masses at the Bulwark.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Look, I do think that things are going to get bad before they get good, in the sense that they're just waiting for any violence to pop off and to try to turn that down. As we saw in his first term, Donald Trump loves to crack down on protests. I do think that LA is showing some of the way and some of the future in pushing back on ICE. And by the way, it's not just Los Angeles and California. There's been in other states so far this week. I think it's in Florida as well. Local people just sort of pushing back on ICE, and predominantly white crowds also, saying like, get out of here. We don't want you here. And there's a reason these guys are masked. We've written about this. This is not some, why do they have to hide their identity if what they're doing is legal and above board and everything's okay when you're, breaking the window of somebody with a crowbar? And I forgot what city that happened in, but basically they were looking for an immigrant. The guy's name was like Alex. They were like, oh, we're looking for Antonio. He's calling his lawyer. They're breaking open his window with a crowbar, a masked agent. So we know that this stuff is overreach and is insane. And I really think it's interesting what place like California, like LA, where they're going to be fighting back. So I think we're going to be seeing more of that, and it only makes sense as they ramp up their interior enforcement with this operation at large, to see moments where people think it's going overboard. Work site raids. We've seen in the past that when there's large worksite raid crackdowns, I think that is something to watch for. If Americans start saying like, wait, you're not going for the employers who are hiring these undocumented people. I was just reading that in 2017, Trump commuted the sentence of a meatpacking executive who was found in the Obama administration to have willfully hired and paid for all these undocumented workers and their paperwork to work there. So we're not going after the employers, but we're kicking open doors and we're getting dudes at Home Depot. And I do think that that's going to continue to piss people off in the country.
I was struck that I think it was Kristi Noem said we're going to prevent, or maybe Trump himself said this, we're going to prevent, Trump I think maybe said it first, we're going to prevent people from wearing masks, demonstrators from wearing masks. And then Noem reiterated it. And someone, I mean, it's kind of amazing since the ICE people have been wearing masks, and
yes,
and allegedly to protect, I don't know what, their families or whatever from retribution. But these demonstrators, they have some fear also, retribution, presumably, But anyway, I'm not really a big fan of wearing masks in either case, I suppose. But
yeah,
did they have the legal authority to stop people from just walking down the street in a mask? I feel like, I don't know. But anyway, I'm struck that they don't even think, this is very revealing. But this part I think is somewhat revealing.
Yeah.
For Noem and Miller and Homan and Trump himself, I suppose, and Vance, the obvious irony of they've been defending the wearing of masks for months. People like you and me have been sort of saying, is that's not really doesn't seem right, you know. Now they're just saying, well, demonstrators can't wear masks, you know. But
Yeah.
and liberals think that's a great gotcha to say, "Ooh, look at that, you're contradicting yourself." But actually, they don't care, you know.
No, 100%. You're right. There's a ton of people that, and we've seen this also in focus groups where people are like, I'm kind of okay. I don't like the way he's doing it. I don't like them going into schools. They're okay with a lot of the immigration enforcement. There was stuff around due process. There was stuff around Kilmar, Garcia, Guantanamo Bay was an early one that in Bulwark focus groups we saw. These were people who were saying they were Latino voters, and one of them was in Texas, and she was saying a lot of these talking points, like MAGA talking points. She was saying that immigrants do take your jobs in Texas, and then later on she said, "What he's doing in Guantanamo Bay is not cool. This is some like Nazi stuff. You can't just disappear people." And that was the first data point for me. And then we saw with El Salvador around the due process stuff. And so I do think that some of that is going to continue to be an issue.
And the masks, I guess. I mean, we'll see if they actually start arresting people for demonstrators for wearing masks, and whether that's constitutional or not. I don't know. That maybe there'd have to be some ordinance, I should think, that could then be tested in court. But I'm just struck. Kristi Noem, Steve Miller. You've covered these people, both in the case of Miller in the first term as well. But who's making policy? Who matters? What are the different roles of all these characters?
I mean, I think that I found it so interesting where they do these reports where they say that Donald Trump like basically believes this stuff and he's for this, but like that Stephen Miller is really the driving force and the one who's getting really ramped up in these meetings and wants them to do. And we're seeing it now. I mean, from reports of him yelling about 3,000 arrests a day and why aren't we going to Home Depot? They have this dream fantasy number of 1 million deportations this year, which I've written is just like not going to happen when you literally look at the numbers. So around the 100 days, I did the piece that was like, okay, even if you look at their lofty inflated numbers, which we could see from the 50-day to the 100-day that it was impossible that they would have, gotten those arrest numbers up to that level and things like that. They're just not on pace for 1 million deportations. And again, it reveals, so 1,500 arrest quota, 3,000. If you were getting criminals, there should be some finite number, and this is not going to. So we know what they're trying to do, right? And when we saw when during the campaign they said, "Well, no, we're just going for criminals," and even Homan kind of said that's where. And then it started going into, well, no, there will be collateral damage, and then Levitt from the podium said, "Well, if you're here illegally, you're a criminal." So I think that's also been really interesting to watch.
I think that's an important point. I mean, they stuck on the collateral damage for a while. We're going after. Sometimes that happens in immigration. It happened in Biden and Obama. They go for a genuine criminal, dangerous person. There are other people there. Once they're apprehended, they may turn out to be undocumented and subject to removal. They don't, and they can be removed. They should be removed to their home country. They shouldn't be, and they should be removed in a decent way and so forth. And but that's probably legal and maybe advisable if they've. I don't know why. Maybe it's not advisable, but anyway, it's within the bounds of, let's say, the debate. I would say what is striking is they've given up all pretense that it's collateral, right? We're now just going for mass deportation. Now, to be fair, those were the signs at the Republican convention. I remember seeing that Republican convention, and mass deportation. That's like a pump. I mean, we're not even. That's not pretending it's criminals. When you use the word mass, I mean, you could have said criminal deportation. Right? Yeah. You could have said deportation of gang members. There are many ways to say that. Mass deportation literally implies the opposite. That's what the word mass implies. It's everyone who's here, presumably undocumented, or in many cases now with the Venezuelans and others, people who were documented and legal and checking in as they were supposed to and holding jobs and paying taxes. But Trump ends their legal status early and abruptly, and then they're undocumented. So, I mean, again, I guess I expect it to be bad, but I'm a little startled by I don't know what word to use, the ferocity almost of the attempt to just remove all these people.
Yeah.
I mean, say people who are on a work site, people who are assembling at a Home Depot to be picked up to do a job. They're not impervious, of course, to being questioned and so forth, but busting in, masked, into handcuffs, into a van, maybe no contact with families or very, very little, and lawyers, and this out as soon as possible. that really is that is mass deportation. I guess we should have taken them literally and seriously when they said that, huh?
This Latino comedian kid did a really good skit, which I would not expect from just sort of like the guys having fun on TikTok, Instagram type of crowd. And it was an ICE. He was playing both the ICE agent and a construction worker. And he said, "We're here at the construction site to get all these criminals." And he said, "Well, they're here working, so how are they criminals?" And and so it's just like it's so it has been from the beginning that we've seen that Americans really did not understand what mass deportation was. Even when you saw it in polling, like CBS News polling, it would have like 53 or 54% support, which we know that if you're supporting Donald Trump and then they ask you, "What do you think about this policy?" Yeah, I support that. That sounds good. And so we saw in both in polling and in focus groups that Americans largely did not know what mass deportation was going to be. And even in interviews, they would say, "Yeah, they're going to get out the criminals. They're not going to get out my neighbor." We've seen all these stories coming out. And by the way, I get so many messages from Democrats who are just like so upset. Like, what did you think was going to happen? Where they're like, "I knew they were going to deport criminals, but I didn't think they were going to get my neighbor Carol." And then people were like, "Well, of course they were going to go after Carol." But once they cleared out, the beginning of what they were doing with criminals. So yeah, that's been pretty insane.
I mean, the Republican convention freaked me out a little on this. I will say the moment I saw where this could go, honestly, I mean, I think a lot of people saw, was the Haitian Vance and the others going on about the Haitians in Springfield, Ohio. There wasn't a pretense, whatever, even the eating cats and dogs thing, which is insane, obviously.
Yeah.
There wasn't that's not a crime. I mean, there was no pretense even of a crime, right? There wasn't like, gee, the crime rate in Springfield, Ohio is quintupled, and here's 6 dramatic incidents of crime, and we've got to do something about it. It was just, there are literally 25,000 Haitians living somewhere who are all legal, so far as we know, with temporary protected status. They're on the books. That's how we know how many there are. That's how we have all the data on how many kids are going to school. They're checking in. They have TPS. That means they checked in with the government, and they were given the status, and they have it for 18 months or whatever. They're mostly working, so far as one could tell. The city's doing better, and we got to get rid of them. I mean, for me, that's in a way it got a little lost in the debate over cats and dogs and the insanity of it all, and then it wasn't taken seriously enough. I was like, well, what a Vance, what a weirdo he is. He's obsessed with these people. The Republican governor, the Republican, I think, mayor and local representatives were fine with what was happening in Springfield, Ohio. That was really a sign that they want in this case, the very dark-skinned Haitians out of there,
Yeah. Well, and wasn't that such a great precursor, early foreshadowing of what was going to happen this administration? Because if it were just some magical barrier of legal and illegal, then this should be going differently. The first thing they did was attack these refugee programs, these asylum programs. You said TPS. There's another one that Biden instituted. And so it's the people who are here legally, who went through legal pathways. We've seen people who were sent to El Salvador. Andre, who we just did an event for the other day, the young Venezuelan gay hairdresser, who is now in CCOT, who was crying for his mother as he was having his head shaved. He showed up to the U.S. and used the CBP One app and demonstrated they were here. The other part of going after workers, so-called criminals, and showing up to a construction site is, why are you showing up to court and getting people? These are criminals. Why are they at court showing up for their court date? So it's just like, these are the things that you make such a good point, that Springfield was this early sign that this wasn't just about, are you here legally or not?
Yeah, if they want to change the rules, they want to, give notice that the program's not going to go on as long as Biden had intended it to. Then maybe they can do that legally, and then they can give people notice that they should prepare to leave or apply for asylum in a different way or something. There are many, many ways to do this that were civilized, is the way I'm going to put it. And there are many ways to seek to abrogate certain protections and certain statuses that could be done legally, could be done in a civilized way, could give people a chance to appeal, could give people time to prepare for their departure if they're going to leave. But none of that was done, right? The fact that what's very clear from the beginning was how much the Trump administration reveled in the suddenness, the brutality, the cruelty, the shock and awe of you're leaving. I guess they thought that would lead to more self-deportation, or it just would satisfy their base, or it satisfies their own sense of how to run things in a brutal way. Speaker John, fine, I'll let you go. But Speaker Johnson, you got to write this newsletter. Sam will kill us both if we spend all afternoon talking. But Sam's fine. But he's good at staying on people's case to get some work done. But not that you need that encouragement. What did Speaker Johnson said this morning on one of the shows? It was a formulation. I was very struck by it. That a peace. Someone said, "Aren't you a little concerned about Texas saying we're going to use active duty Marines in the streets of LA?" Is that kind of what we do routinely? We might do it if there's Katrina or if there's riots with 50 people being killed in a couple of nights. But I mean, just throwing that out with sort of relish. And John said, "Well, peace through strength is a very important principle of ours in foreign and domestic affairs." And that was extremely revealing. I mean, whatever. I'm a Reaganite, so I like peace through strength. To think that something is appropriate in dealing with foreign enemies is also the right way to deal with people living, working, as you say, many cases legally, some cases undocumented here in America.
Mm-hmm.
It's just striking that was John. No sense of what we want to follow. Of course, we're following the law. President Trump's he could have said that. President Trump's following the law. No one's shown that anything in this declaration is illegal. I mean, he could have gone into that kind of defense. He could have gone into some kind of defense of the decency of the policy, I suppose. That's pretty hard, but he didn't even try to. Right? We're now peace through strength. That's the way the U.S. government's going to decide how to deal with people living and working in the United States.
It's also different laws and for different people. They had some sort of very strongly worded statement yesterday that I don't have in front of me, but it was, to the effect of, if you confront, if you attack, if you have some sort of confrontation with law enforcement, we're going to come down on you so hard, etc. What happened with all the January 6 people that were pardoned?
Well,
and you have Stephen Miller saying, quote tweeting something the other day and saying federal law is basically sacrosanct and is the top. And I'm like, what happened to states' rights? Didn't these guys used to talk? SB 1070 is a state immigration law. Texas in 2023 passed a law where they were basically like making it Texas state law that crossing the border was a crime. Immigration has always been like a civil offense and not a criminal offense. So these states have done whatever they wanted, but now that it's going the other direction, Miller says that federal law is the number one thing.
What a moment. I mean, a bit of a worrisome moment, obviously, both from a human point of view in terms of what's happening, but also from a broader, I'd say, legal, constitutional, where the country is going point of view. But Adrian, keep on covering it as intelligently and effectively, but also from a sort of human perspective, as you've really brought that to bear too so well in the newsletter and in other things you've done for us at the Bulwark. And I really appreciate that. So thanks for everything.
Thanks so much, sir. Thanks for having me. This was great.
And thanks for joining us on Bulwark on Sunday.